Hiya, my name is Anya, and I'm here to lay something spiritual on ya. So today, I want to talk to you about the first holiday that I'm doing a video on, and that is Samhain. What is Samhain? Well, if you've watched my video on the Wheel of the Year, you'll know that Samhain is the last holiday on the Wheel of the Year. Now the word Samhain in and of itself, it is a Celtic word. It is pronounced Samhain. I know looking at it, if you're not familiar with Celtic languages and how words are often pronounced in Celtic languages, you might look at it and think it's pronounced Samhain. It is not. It's pronounced Samhain. In other Celtic languages, it might be pronounced more like Samhain, but for the most part, a lot of us tend to pronounce it as Samhain. And overall, Samhain is a Celtic holiday, and it's where a lot of our traditions for modern day Halloween come from. So again, as I said, on the Wheel of the Year, it's the very last holiday. It is one of 4 fire festivals on the Wheel of the Year, along with Imbolc, Beltane, and Lunasa, and it is the holiday of death, essentially. It is the death of the year. It is the final holiday where we as pagans, as individuals, look at how the life cycle is now coming to an end. We have watched it been reborn and renewed. We have watched as it has grown and flourished to its greatest potential and the highest peaks of nature. And from our harvest seasons, we started to see it slowly decline until we are here at Samhain, where we are essentially saying goodbye, farewell to not just the summertime, but the year as a whole. It's the unofficial start to these dark months. It is also the last harvest festival, with our first one being Lunasa or Lammas, and the second one being Mabon or the Autumn Equinox. So Samhain is that last time to harvest and collect the things that we ourselves have been growing throughout the year. If you've watched my Wheel of the Year video, you know that a lot of these holidays on the Wheel of the Year are associated with the god and the goddess who they themselves are associated with the sun and the earth. God being representative of the sun and the sun's life cycle and paths throughout the year, and the goddess being representative of nature, the planet Earth herself. As we watch these changes go through the sun and the earth in the cycle of a year, that is where we can see the differing strengths of the god and the goddess during those times. So where are the god and the goddess now in their journey? Well, the god, or the sun, essentially sacrifices himself around our first harvest season of Lunasa or Lammas. And this can be interpreted in a lot of ways. He can give his life so that the earth remains fertile and fruitful, essentially giving his life to the earth and the fruit that she bears, and giving of himself to ensure that that life continues. The life on Earth, the life of the goddess and the fruit she bears continues. So by Mabon or the Autumn Equinox, we do start seeing that the sun has lessened in strength. We see that the daytime hours and the nighttime hours are sort of equal at this point, so we can see how that can represent the god's strength slowly dwindling as he has sacrificed his life for the life on earth. In that sense, around Mabon or the equinox, the god is descending into hibernation himself, or he is descending into the underworld to rest out his time until he returns to earth again. Other stories suggest that around Letha or the summer solstice is when the god, at the height of his power, also then loses a battle to the Holly King, who reigns during the dark months, the winter months, the approaching colder seasons. So this again might be symbolic that the Green Man, who would have reigned over the spring and the summer months, has now returned to rest. So again, what we need to look at there is that essentially for our god, our sun, and our male aspect of divinity, he is going into rest, sleep, hibernation. Some pantheons might look at it that he is deceased until it is time to be reborn again at Yule. This is where the god's journey is at this stage. Samhain is the time where we start seeing the transition in the goddess. So the goddess at this time, at this season, the last of her fruits that have been grown and have flourished during the summer months are being collected and harvested in preparation for the cold and dark months of winter. So if at Beltane and the summer solstice, Letha, if at these times the goddess could be seen in her mother stage, her warm and welcoming and fertile stages. At this point, she is transitioning into being a crone. And I do want to stress here, like I stressed in my Wheel of the Year video, words like the Cailleach, the hag, the crone, these are words that can essentially describe a transition from one stage to another in terms of a life cycle, going from a maiden to a mother to then a crone. Crone especially is meant to be a word, I feel, of empowerment, because they are stages of life that we all go through. And it becomes a stage where you begin to stand on your own. The crone is essentially this graduation from desire and of need to be self-sacrificing and taking care of everyone, to recognizing what do you need to do, what needs to be done. It can be considered a harsher time, but it can also be considered a time of just coming into your own. The crone stage is sort of a fun stage that I will talk about in another video. The transition in nature is also symbolic of the transition in the goddess. As we see the leaves begin to change colors, and at this point in Samhain, we've probably seen a lot of the trees just lose their leaves, and essentially everything is starting to look a lot more barren and maybe even a little dead to us. Again, this is all representative of this time of the year at Samhain. So as nature begins this transition, what does this mean for the goddess? Well, this can mean a number of different things depending upon how you look at the stories. In some stories, she may descend into the underworld in order to comfort and be with the god during his time of rest and recuperation in the underworld. But other stories say that if the god has gone into hibernation within nature itself for his own hibernation, she might find the cave in which he is resting and go to comfort him. Even other stories talk about how the goddess at this stage transitions into the Cailleach, or the hag, or the crone. And as I said, these are not words to be feared, they are transitions of time. The Cailleach represents the harshness of the approaching season as we are going into the winter months, the dark months. It is sort of a very harsh time where we don't get the sun as long, and days and nights are biting with cold and chill. So it's a very harsh time, and that's why at this stage we might look at the goddess as transitioning into the Cailleach, which would be appropriate also for Samhain. And the Cailleach actually is a great example of how the feminine isn't always this pretty and warm and welcoming figure. What we can often forget is part of the whole aspect of divine feminine is the dark feminine, the idea of strength in knowing what needs to be done and then also getting it done. We can look at that as a very masculine thing, but the Cailleach here, it represents that. The dying leaves from the trees essentially fall to the ground in their death, in their wake, but these leaves become blankets and warmth for the creatures that are hibernating under the soils. And this death, this purging of life at this season allows it so that next season life can be reborn again. So it is this harsh time of, yes, thinking about death and dying, but also doing what we need in order to survive. And that's where this idea of the Cailleach comes in, where she's harsh and forceful, but she's doing what she does in order to prepare herself for life beginning anew again at Yule. It's a side of the feminine that we don't often get, because I think a lot of times in modern society we tend to look at feminine as warm and happy and beautiful and welcoming and compassionate. And yes, the feminine can be all of those things, but the feminine can equally be standing in your own strength and knowing what needs to be done and acting on it. It is the fierce mama bear who feels her cubs are threatened. The feminine can also be just as fearsome when it needs to be. And that's sort of what this season is for the goddess. It's whether she is going to rest with the god or she is beginning her transition into the Cailleach. She also recognizes there is a lot of transitioning happening at this holiday in particular on the Wheel of the Year. And that's actually very fair, because Samhain is the death holiday, and death to a lot of pagans is often just seen as a transition. It can be very hard to see this when we are coming at it from a Western society perspective, which does try to distance people from the realities of death and dying and grief. It makes it so that we have a very difficult time processing death and dealing with it and working through the grief that accompanies it. So being from a society that tries to put this bar between death, dying, and grief can make it very difficult to understand how a holiday like Samhain can be incredibly beautiful. That's why it's important to remember that death in and of itself is also a transition. Anyone that reads tarot cards will tell you that the death card a lot of times is about change and transition. So the goddess going from being a mother to being the Kaliach or a Crone, it is just another transition to another state of life. And that's what we all should be looking at growing older as, at transitioning into new stages of life, which yes, ultimately ends in death and resting, but even this is a transition of itself. We cannot be reborn at Yule without the death of an old season. We cannot have new life in the world without releasing life already here. It's a story that we're all terrified and uncomfortable with, but it is the beautiful reality that if we want something new, we have to be willing to let go of what we already had. So Samhain is the perfect time of the year to really think on these things and reflect on these things. And we can see that in a lot of the stories that I've just told about where the god is, where the goddess is, and in considering the position of the sun and how we're going to see it continue to get weak until that longest night at Yule, and in the goddess and the fruit of her womb, the earth itself in its transitions along this time of year. All of these things, watching everything go into hibernation, seeing the snow that falls and how quiet and calm and cold and dark everything is. This is why this time of the year is all about reflecting on death and the changes that we all go through as we live our own wheel of the year every single year in every aspect of our lives. So at Samhain, it is a time where we look at these things and we reflect on them and we remember and honor and understand that as nature goes through these cycles and these changes from being born until the day it dies, as nature goes through them, so too do we. Because we as human beings are a part of that cycle. Again, I think Western society tries to distance ourselves from the idea of being connected to nature. No, we're somehow separate and above it, but we are not. Actually, we all have to go through these changes, and honoring them and understanding them and accepting them helps you connect better to them and understand how to work with them and breathe into them. So that's why this holiday can be just as important, but it's also such a big celebration for pagans. Most of the pagans I know genuinely love Samhain, yes, because of its associations to Halloween, because there is the fun aspects of Halloween, the symbology and the themes that come along with it, but it is, as much as it is a recognition that our life cycle ends, it is also a celebration of the life that we have and how we've made it through another year and can begin preparing for a new one to be reborn on the winter solstice. So I hope that's given you a little bit more insight into Samhain, what Samhain is, and what's going on with the gods and the goddess and the sun and nature and all that fun stuff. I hope it's given you a few different insights. Anyway, I hope you guys have a wonderful Samhain and a wonderful Halloween, and I will talk to you all later. Thanks. Anya out. Bye.